Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video, and today we are going to go back a few years from some of the stuff that we've been talking about. We're going to dive into another video from BazBattles. I think this is the second one of theirs that I've done. It's really good stuff, and I thought I'd go all the way back to 1066 and talk about the Battle of Hastings. It's pointed to as one of the pivotal moments of history, certainly of Western history, and most definitely of English history. This is the moment of the Norman conquest. This is when the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes stop being the main power, the main authority in England, and it becomes a Norman Frenchman by the name of William the Bastard. So I'm not going to give a lot of background into this. I'm sure they're going to talk about it, and I'll just kind of add my own thoughts as we go along. As always, these reaction videos are meant for us to have an opportunity to have a conversation and to learn from each other. I do not know everything. This is an area I know a little bit more about than some of the videos that we've watched, but I do not know everything, and so we're here to learn from each other. So add your own comments, add your own insight, add your own thoughts in the comment section below to what we talk about here, and let's all learn together. So this is the Battle of Hastings.
December of the year 1066, William of Normandy lands in Sussex with an army 7,000 men strong to join the fight for the English throne. King Harold Godwinson rushes back south to London to mount the resistance against yet another invader. A few weeks later, the two armies met in the decisive encounter on the hills near Hastings, a turning point in English history. Northwestern Asia Minor, the hot summer of the year 1035. Duke Robert of Normandy was on the return from his Jerusalem pilgrimage when he caught a lethal disease and died shortly after at the age of 35. When news reached Normandy, young William the Bastard was being prepared to act as his father's successor, fulfilling Robert's will. William's early reign was full of hindrances due to his illegitimate descendancy, as his father never bothered to get married, but was aided by prominent supporters, including the Archbishop of Rouen.
Now, it's important to note here that this is a really uncommon thing to have happen, to have an illegitimate son inherit a title, especially a major title like the Duchy of Normandy. This really was just unheard of. In fact, you can look throughout history, especially history in England, of plenty of times where a succession would have been much easier had illegitimate children been able to inherit. For example, Queen Victoria would never have come to the throne had illegitimate children been able to inherit, because her uncles, who died without legitimate children, in some cases had many, many illegitimate children. There's other cases where this happened. Henry VIII had an illegitimate son, and his whole quest to try and have a legitimate son, the whole thing with his divorce and his break from the Catholic Church so he can marry Anne Boleyn, was all predicated on that idea of having a son. Well, he had a illegitimate son named Henry Fitzroy that he had with a woman named Bessie Blunt. Had illegitimate children been able to inherit, that would not have been as much of an issue. All of human history could have been different, especially Western history, had this been done differently. So I'm not entirely sure why it is that this was such an easy transition, but it must say something about William the Conqueror as a man, that he was so highly regarded that there was so much support for his succession despite his illegitimacy.
He reached adulthood and started independent rule. His early years as a Duke of Normandy passed under the constant struggle for power, during which William honed his political and battle-commanding skills. In 1051, he received the message from his distant relative, childless English King Edward, who named William as his successor and the next King of England. Being involved in the internal quarrel with the powerful House of Godwin, Edward probably used the absence of an heir as a tool in his political game. Godwin and his sons tried to prevent the rise of Norman influence in the...
So, you know, in the Anglo-Saxon culture, it was not necessarily an automatic thing that the next in line, whether it's a child or a sibling, inherits. It was actually something that was voted on. But very often it did go to a son or to a younger brother if there were no sons, things like that. In Edward the Confessor's case, he doesn't have that. And so it's a political bargaining tool. It's a guy who doesn't have children. Who's the throne going to go to, and how do I position myself to get that influence? And so the two primary contenders then, well, there's really three, because there's the Danish contenders, the Vikings as we call them. They were typically called the Danes. Danish, Scandinavian, however you want to look at it. But you have them, you have the Godwin family, who's the most powerful nobles in England, and then of course you have William the Bastard across the Channel in Normandy.
In the Anglo-Saxon royal court, and were banished by Edward, who then chose William as his heir. Although Godwin got back to England with an army some months later and reclaimed his position, he apparently accepted the king's choice of successor. Godwin died a few years later, but his sons had risen to power and gained control over the major earldoms of England. The oldest living son, Harold, succeeded his father as Earl of Wessex and became the king's trusted advisor.
And yeah, Earl of Wessex, this is a big deal, because remember the kings of England, the early kings of England, come out of the House of Wessex. Originally England was multiple kingdoms. You had Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Kent, Northumbria. These are all separate kingdoms that were eventually united a few generations after Alfred the Great, who was king of Wessex. Being the Earl of Wessex was a big deal, and there weren't dukes at this time, so next to the king, the Earl was the highest rank which you could have.
Meanwhile, to the south, William pursued the expansion of his rule, and by the year 1065, he reigned either directly or indirectly over the entire northern French coast, from Brittany to Flanders. Then, in December of 1065, King Edward fell into a coma and died at the beginning of 1066, which immediately triggered the fight for the now empty throne. Some claim that the old king regained consciousness shortly before his death and entrusted the kingdom to Harold.
And really what they're pinning this on was that he woke up, pointed at Harold Godwinson, and that was used to interpret that he was saying Harold should be my successor, despite the fact that many years before he had named William as his successor. So now you're going to trigger a three-way war for the crown.
Who decided to snub Edward's earlier will and crowned himself on the funeral day. Upon hearing the news, William immediately claimed his right to the English throne. But he wasn't the only one interested. Harald Hardrada of Norway based his claim on an agreement made 30 years earlier between King Hardicanute and Danish King Magnus. It's worth mentioning that prior to his death, Edward promised the English crown to yet another man, Edward the Exile, whom he recalled from banishment 10 years earlier. He was already dead by 1066, but his son, Edgar Atheling, inherited his right and appeared as another pretendant.
And this is one of your main Anglo-Saxon claimants to the throne. For the better part of the 11th century up to this point, England had been ruled by the Danes, the Kingdom of Norway. And you had Canute the Great, and you have others, as they mentioned, Harald Hardrada is going to put a claim on the throne. So it wasn't really out of the realm of imagination that it would end up being a Norwegian king.
Though he lacked strong support compared to the other candidates. This may look quite complex, and probably was. Large-scale conflict was inevitable. War preparations began on both sides of the Channel. Just when winter passed by, William ordered shipwrights to build a war fleet capable of transporting a large army to England. While thousands of trees were being cut down, William gathered all the nobles willing to back his cause. He managed to attract help from around France, Brittany, and Flanders, promising wealth and positions. William of Poitiers stated that the bastard obtained the blessing and support of Pope Alexander II, but that is questionable at best. He finished preparations in early August, gathering a total number of 7,000 men. In order to lead and maintain cohesion within his diverse army, William must have been a talented organizer and a respected leader.
Yeah, and this goes back to the whole fact that a guy who was a bastard was given so much support for such a powerful position as Duke of Normandy in the first place. It has to say something about the man that he was able to lead these people. So I think all of this tells us something about William the Conqueror, that he was a charismatic leader, he was a powerful leader, he was a capable leader. But honestly, this was not necessarily a foregone conclusion he was going to win this battle. When he gets to Hastings, despite the fact that Harold Godwinson had already had to fight one battle and won a major victory at Stamford Bridge, William did not have the upper hand in this battle.
Although ready to do so, he didn't rush to invade England because of unfavorable north winds. It was also possible that he knew Harold Godwinson expected the Norman invasion, with his army camping near the Isle of Wight. But in early September, Godwinson was forced to disassemble his troops due to depleting supplies and harvest time being just around the corner. A few weeks later, the wind finally changed, and William departed the Norman coast on the 27th of September. He reached English shores the following day and landed in Pevensey Bay in Sussex. An anecdote says that upon landing, William slipped and fell on the ground, scaring his superstitious folk. But he played it cool, grasped a handful of soil, and proclaimed, "England is ours." The Normans were probably aware that Anglo-Saxon forces were busy to the north, striving to repel the Viking invasion of Harold Hardrada, so they took their time, marched west to set up a temporary camp near Hastings and fortified the town. From there, William mustered his troops and launched parties to plunder the region.
And you might find yourself asking the question, why did William stay right there? If he knew that the other army was up in the north, all the way up in York fighting, why didn't he just march his army toward London, for example? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is he didn't really know for sure that there wasn't an army coming his direction. This is not a time when you have up-to-date news events happening. So he had no idea for sure where Harold Godwinson's army was. They could have been on their way back. Another reason is that he's got to stay close to his ships so he can get supplies as needed. Of course, he's sending out raiding parties to get some supplies as well. But he also has to have an exit strategy if this doesn't go well. And by staying near Hastings, he can very quickly get out of there if things go badly. Because he knows in the end what he's got to do is defeat Harold's army. And that can happen anywhere, and it may as well happen in a place that is most favorable to him.
Meanwhile, Godwinson feasted in York to celebrate his bloody victory over the Norsemen near Stamford Bridge.
And it was a great
after
victory.
An exhausting 4-day march.
And we'll watch that one at some point because I think BazBattles does one about Stamford Bridge as well. But Harold won a major victory. It was a brilliant victory. It was an overwhelming victory. And it largely kept his army intact.
When he learned of the Norman landing to the south, he promptly ceased the celebrations and together with his best men rushed back to London in yet another rapid movement. He reached the capital in 1 week and spent an additional week to prepare for the upcoming encounter. Harold kept all of the housecarls who survived the bloodbath of Stamford Bridge, but gathered fresh feared units. Godwinson's army was roughly a similar size to the Norman army. He could have probably waited a few more days to allow more soldiers to join, but Harold's confidence after the last battle and eagerness to relieve the people harmed by the Normans pushed him to set off as soon as his force was ready.
And those are reasonable, motives behind his decision to march. He won a major victory. He had to have a lot of confidence, and that happens. You get overconfidence when you win big victories like that. He's feeling in a very strong and very secure position. And honestly, for a good part of the Battle of Hastings, he was still in a very strong and secure position, and then it all goes south.
Godwinson hoped to use the element of surprise, like he did versus the Vikings 2 weeks earlier. But on the day prior to the battle, William's scouts found out that the Saxon army had departed London and was marching south. Upon learning that William had set out for Hastings, Harold started to seek out a suitable place to deploy his units, and finally decided to hold a defensive position on top of the hill 10 kilometers northwest of the town, in between forested and marshy terrain. The composition of Harold's army didn't change much since Stamford Bridge. He relied solely on infantry comprised of professional housecarl units and a poorly armed and disciplined feared formation levied days prior to the battle. In contrast, William commanded a mix of infantry, archers, and cavalry. His army deployed into 3 divisions, roughly corresponding to the origin of the troops.
And now this is a good point here, because imagine if Harold Godwinson had archers. He's up on the hill. He's in a strong defensive position. Imagine you get some archers, you force them into an attack situation, and you probably could have devastated William's army. Even without the archers, he still does pretty well for a while.
The front line was formed by archers who had their backs secured by infantry units. The mounted force was held in reserve as a third line. While holding a good defensive position on higher ground, with his flanks covered by marshes and woods on both sides, Harold barely could do anything more than just defend. His housecarl ranks were thinned out after the last battle and were unable to play a more active role. The majority of feared units, though fierce and determined to fight for their land, were mostly poorly armed and unskilled peasants that posed a limited threat to the enemy.
Especially if you're under fire from archers.
The battle was started by Norman archers who attempted to weaken the tightly packed Saxon lines, shooting uphill at an unfavorable angle with little effect. Arrows either bounced off the shield wall or landed far behind the English position. Then, William sent the infantry units to engage in melee fighting, hoping to break Harold's shield wall. Advancing Normans suffered a barrage of axes, stones, and spears, but eventually reached English front ranks, and hand-to-hand combat began. Casualties rose on both sides. Norman infantry failed to punch a hole in the Saxon line, so William sent idling cavalrymen, hoping to crush Harold's solid defense.
So look at this. I mean, it's going pretty well for the Saxons. They've held up well under the archers, who did not have much of an effect against their shield wall going uphill. They're defending against infantry hitting their flanks, and they're holding their own. Now cavalry is going to try and hit their center, again, coming uphill. It's all going well.
But decently armored mounted troops, while good at melee, lacked long lances and armored horses, which limited their effectiveness as true shock units, capable of breaking enemy lines. Battle raged for hours. Due to heavy losses, many feared units were forced to replace the fallen housecarls in the first line. Normans lost many men as well. Even Duke William got his horse slain under him twice, which caused a rumour that he was dead. Around midday, William's left flank, comprised of Bretons, retreated, and many of the other units followed.
Now right here, this is where it looks like the Saxons have the battle, but what they're actually doing is losing right here, and you'll see why in just a minute.
It's not clear whether it was a real flight or just a feigned retreat planned and performed by William. Many of the battle-frenzied Anglo-Saxon militia pursued the running enemy, disobeying Harold's order to remain in formation.
So you can imagine Harold, he sees his men moving forward. Their formation's working, their strategy's working. All you have to do is hold. All you have to do is stay where you are. Make the attacker, the invader, come to you. Don't get sucked into this, and this is when it all falls apart.
Thus, crippling their only chance for victory. The Normans stopped the retreat and attacked drawn-off English units, which were soon surrounded and crushed by Norman cavalry. Harold's remaining troops fought bravely for the rest of the day, struggling to withstand William's now dominant forces at the cost of very heavy losses. When the sun was about to set over the horizon, Harold's brothers Gyrith and Leofwin were slain. Shortly after, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England was struck in the eye by an arrow, which triggered a final massive rout of the then leaderless Saxon forces. William won the battle and had the road to London wide open, where he ascended to the English throne 2 months later.
Think about how differently history goes if Harold's right flank just holds its position and doesn't advance to try and hit the fleeing enemy. I mean, it is not an understatement to say that all of history changes based on that one act.
The Battle of Hastings marked the beginning of the Norman conquest, which took several years and heavily influenced both English and European history.
So, fascinating stuff. It's one of my favorite eras of history to talk about. Let me know your thoughts. Add to the conversation. Let's continue this talk. We'll probably look at Stamford Bridge at some point. But don't forget to hit that like button and check out BazBattles. Their channel's fantastic. I'll put a link in the description to the original video. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.